Hey fearsome friends, happy Saturday. Whatever you're doing tonight, always keep an eye out for anyone lurking in the shadows, and make sure your red flag radar is switched on. But in the meantime, sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. Before I met my co-worker, he held some sort of managerial position at a store that sold shoes. For over a year, he received phone calls from a man who claimed to be inquiring about women's shoes and was only interested in speaking to female members of staff. Whenever he was able to speak to a female member of staff, he would ask her about the shoes she wore and how comfortable they felt. According to my co-worker, these calls would take place almost daily, and the caller seemed pleased to hear about shoes that weren't even sold in the store. Thinking this was of course strange, my co-worker warned another shoe store in the area about the caller. The manager of that store claimed that they'd been receiving similar calls, and the caller never seemed to be actually interested in buying any shoes. My co-worker blocked his number on 2 separate occasions, but he would simply just get a new number. After having his number blocked for a 3rd time, though, he began actually entering the store and making the women staff members feel very uncomfortable. My co-worker eventually banned him from entering the store and accused him of involving unwilling participants in his fetish. But the man calmly denied making the phone calls and also claimed that his interest in shoes was not sexual. He left the store that day, but ended up returning about a month later, and my co-worker started shouting at the man, but he allegedly remained eerily calm. The store closed down less than a year later. According to my co-worker, a strange car began pulling up outside his apartment complex and sitting there for hours. He mentioned this to me a few months ago, but I wasn't sure what to make of it. I have experienced having a stalker before, but it's hard to link the mysterious car to the man from the shoe store. Recently, however, I noticed that a strange man always seemed to follow us around during lunch breaks. He wouldn't say anything, and would only stare at us. After I pointed out his presence, my co-worker informed me that he recognized this individual as the shoe-obsessed man. It's been 2 years since my co-worker left the shoe store, but I've only known him for a few months. Earlier today I received a friend request on Facebook from a name I didn't recognize, but I definitely knew who the profile picture was. It was the man who had been following us. Now I rarely use Facebook, and I'm not even friends with my co-worker, who the man had initially targeted. That co-worker claimed to have deleted his Facebook account because this guy was following him again, and he suspects that the man had used Facebook to track him down at his new job, that he's sure his address wouldn't have been on Facebook. He still remains certain that the car that waits outside his house is the shoe-obsessed stalker, and I believe him. Back in my single days, I often tried online dating apps, and I talked with this one guy in particular, who I'll call Tom for the sake of this story. Tom and I started chatting after we'd matched, and it went well, so we progressed to talking over the phone. He had a nice voice, and I liked that he could carry a conversation, because I always feel awkward with talking to people, and I always have a problem of running out of things to say. My mind will just draw a complete blank when I'm nervous, so having him talking to me on the other end of the line was a nice relief. After some successful phone conversations, we went on a couple of dates that were surprisingly very pleasant, and we met up at public venues and a couple of restaurants. We both had a background in English, and he was also a writer like me, so it was nice to have these interests in common. Our conversations were easy, in-depth, and flowed nicely, so I invited him to a function in my community, where he introduced himself to my neighbours, friends, and family. They kind of looked at me questioningly, like they were asking, "Is this your new boyfriend?" with raised eyebrows. I told them that no, we were just friends who were still getting to know each other, and it felt too soon to call him my boyfriend. But Tom said differently, telling everyone that I was in fact his girlfriend. I had to keep correcting him and felt a little embarrassed. I regretted bringing him to the gathering, actually, and overall we really only dated. I use the term loosely, for about 3 weeks before things started to get really weird. Tom had increased the number of texts he was sending me and wanted to spend a lot more time with me, asking to see me almost every single day. At first I thought it was flattering, as I enjoyed the attention and the feeling of being wanted. But after a while, I'm not exactly sure when, it escalated to a really uncomfortable level, and I remember just feeling smothered. He'd blow up my phone, asking me what I was doing, but it didn't seem like he was asking in a casual, "how are you" kind of way. There was a controlling undertone to the question, and when I'd answer, he'd want to know every detail about where I was, what I was doing, and what time I was doing it, etc. I considered that maybe he was just feeling insecure, and that he would calm down with time. On our next outing, I met up with him and my friend so we could go out to a bar and hang out. At some point though, my friend wanted to leave because she wasn't feeling well, so we said goodbye to Tom and I left the bar to take her home. However, when I checked my phone after arriving home late that same night, I saw that I had a bunch of angry text messages from Tom. "Why didn't you kiss me goodbye?" and "You don't really like me, do you?" I wrote back saying, "I just had to take my friend home. I didn't know I was supposed to kiss you." "Kissing me shouldn't be an obligation," he said. "Sorry, I just didn't think about it because I was occupied. Can we let this go? I'm tired and I want to go to bed now," I said. "Okay, you're right. I'm sorry. Please don't ghost me, okay?" he replied, or something along those lines. I didn't know why then, but I just felt really weird and that he was too clingy, and of course it only got worse from there. Fast forward some time to whenever I talked to him, it would always seem like he would deliberately be trying to initiate an argument or fight. I'm not the confrontational type, and this was incredibly draining for me to keep up with. "Why does everything have to be an argument?" I asked one day. He explained how he grew up in an abusive household, and he was used to the members of his family fighting and arguing all the time. It felt normal to him. Well, I'm not, and frankly, it feels a little scary to me. People in my family talk things out calmly when we have disagreements. We don't raise our voices, jump to accusations, or have temper tantrums, I explained. "You're right," he said. But of course it made no difference and nothing changed. I'd lost the spark and that initial attraction I'd had for him. I actually felt repelled by him now, and I decided I just couldn't see him anymore. I felt really sad and guilty for his life situation and the way he grew up. But at the same time, the roller coaster dynamic of our communication was really starting to take a toll on my own mental health. When I broke up with him, he threatened to commit suicide, and I didn't know what to do. So I asked my parents and some of my old psychology course classmates for advice. Everyone advised me that Tom's mental instability wasn't my responsibility, and that he needed to seek professional help. He kept flooding me with messages on all my accounts, and as mentioned before, he was a writer, so he'd send beautifully written, lengthy pleas for forgiveness. I replied with, "I really just need a break right now." But he ignored this and would just keep trying. At one point he even sent me a photo of his dog, telling me he says, "Hi, I miss you." That's when I thought, okay, this is weird and manipulative, so now I'm going to block you. And I did just that. I blocked him on everything. Phone numbers, social media accounts, etc., etc. And when he couldn't reach me, he resorted to some drastic measures. He then emailed my parents. "Why is he messaging us?" my parents asked me. "It feels weird and creepy." "I don't know," I said honestly. "He's pleading with us to convince you to get back with him. I don't want to be involved in this," my mum said. "I don't want you involved either," I said. My parents knew what had been happening already because I'd asked for their advice when he had threatened suicide. So whilst having a discussion about it, our consensus was to offer no response, and they proceeded to block him as well. Next it was my friend who had gone with us to the bar. Tom is messaging me saying that you broke his heart or something, she said. What happened? Did you do something to him? I broke up with him, that's it. Don't respond, just block him. She obliged, but of course that wasn't the end of it. Tom then reached out to my neighbours. I guess he'd remembered their names at that community function and memorised them all by heart, then reached out to each one of them with a lengthy, elaborate story about how we'd been together for at least 6 months and that we were passionately and madly in love with each other. In this story he portrayed himself as some kind of victim, like I was the villainess, man-eater or something weird. But I don't know all the details of the messages, because I didn't want to read them. What did you do to this poor guy? I kept being asked over and over again by different neighbours, so I was forced to keep repeating an explanation about what happened. We only went out for a few weeks, I told them, a month at most, and I advised them to please not respond or encourage him. Honestly, I'm a very private person, so having my whole community know about my situation was deeply humiliating for me, and this went on for about a year. I'd have someone tell me Tom tried to reach out to me again, and there was one older lady neighbour of mine that actually continued talking to Tom over email, even though I'd asked her to stop. But he writes so beautifully, and he's a beautiful dark soul, she said. The whole thing put a rift between her and her husband too, so that was a thing. A separate neighbour told me she was afraid for my personal safety, saying he seems like a stalker type, like from one of those crime shows, which didn't do much to help my anxiety. I spent a lot of time indoors for a while after that, and I felt withdrawn, insecure, deeply embarrassed, and most of all, scared. I felt like I had to look over my shoulder whenever I stepped outside my home, and I took a long break from dating apps, feeling a bit shaken up from the whole experience. 2 years later, in 2018, he texted me from a different phone number saying, "You know who this is. If you still don't want me back, don't respond, and I'll leave you alone forever." Even though he didn't give me his name, I knew it was Tom, and frankly I was relieved. My first inclination was to think, I'm finally free. Thankfully he's stayed true to his word and hasn't messaged me, my friends, parents or neighbours again since. I just hope it stays that way. I, a 23-year-old female, was 20 at the time, and I'd moved in with my uncle in San Antonio, Texas, with the agreement that I didn't have to pay rent as long as I helped him out with chores and my cousins. I got a job at a well-known coffee chain downtown, close to the touristy part of the area, and we had a lot of regulars and a lot of homeless coming in and out. I felt relatively safe though, because I got to know the people there, and there almost always was a lot of foot traffic. I used to even take walks after work in the area, especially since I was super close to the Riverwalk. Skip to a couple of months into the job, and I was friends with everyone I worked with. We were all really close, and on this particular day, it was one of my co-workers' last days. There was about 3 guys who had been in there almost all morning, but they hadn't bought anything. They were just hanging out, which wasn't unusual for my location. On my break, I decided to walk down to a nearby drugstore so I could get a farewell card and maybe a small gift for said co-worker who was leaving. So I walked out and put my earphones in, and before I could press play, I heard the door open behind me and footsteps following behind. Whoever it was had caught up to me and started walking beside me, matching my pace exactly. I turned to look, and it was one of the guys that had been there all morning. He was a bit taller than me, and reminded me a lot of Lakeith Stanfield. He tried to ask for my number, and I politely told him no, but he persisted, and I, with a short temper, told him to F off. He stopped and stared at me in surprise, as I don't look like someone who speaks up or would be rude, and he stood there as I walked away. By the time I went back, they were gone, and I proceeded to tell my co-workers about the encounter. We laughed it off, and I thought that would be the end of it, but I was wrong. Every shift after that, he would already be there, just hanging out, or would walk in mid-shift. Sometimes he'd be with somebody else, and sometimes on his own, but I just assumed he was just another homeless person, because how else was he always able to be around? My shifts were sporadic. Some days I opened up, some days I closed, and some days I worked midday. But it didn't matter, because he was always there. At that point I started feeling paranoid, as I would always catch him staring in my direction. He never ordered anything, never talked to me, and luckily wouldn't follow me. He would just sit there watching me. I started mentioning it to my co-workers, and they said they'd noticed it too. One of my team leaders would help me out by sending me to wash dishes in the back or organize the cooler, and they would also try and place themselves to try and block me from his view. I began to feel really uncomfortable at work, and sometimes when I closed, a co-worker would walk me to my car before heading home themselves, or if I wasn't closing, they'd still walk me to my car and turn around and head back into work. Then one day of him just staring, I was working the register that day. He walked up and ordered a water. I asked for his name for his order, so now I had his first name, just in case. Then he took his water and sat down. I had mentioned him before to my manager, but because he hadn't really done anything, we couldn't do anything besides note it in the manager book. The next day I worked with my manager and 2 other co-workers. I told them I had to go to the bathroom real quick, and there were 2 bathrooms right next to each other, but sort of hidden from the coffee bar and register, and they weren't gender specific. I walked around the bar to the lobby area, and had to pass his table and walk down the lobby on my way. I noticed him get up before going inside the bathroom, and when I sat down to do my business, someone rattled the doorknob. I shouted out that it was occupied, but whoever it was just kept rattling the door until I'd finished. When I opened the door up, though, there was no one there. Walking back, I noticed him adjusting back into his chair, and I was now super freaked out and told my boss. He couldn't say anything to him, though, because we had no proof that it was him. Later that shift, he got up and picked up a coffee from the pickup area. My boss assumed he had ordered it and let him take it, but I told him he hadn't, and that it wasn't even his name. My boss used this as an opportunity to tell him that if he does something like that again, he's banned. The man apologized and actually stuck to the rules every day after that, but he did go back to watching me. Cut to Valentine's Day, when one of my team leaders and I would be scheduled to work with certain Thursdays after closing to deep clean the store. We would stay until 1 a.m, and this was one of those Thursdays. We were almost done, and I had to clean the bathrooms as one of the last chores, and after I'd finished, I walked out of the bathroom, and I saw him peeking in with both hands pressed to the window, his eyes wide, just staring at me with this super intense look. I froze for a second, just staring back, and noticed that one of his palms that was pressed to the window had a purple foam heart. He didn't move an inch, and I freaked out and ran back into the bathroom, then shouted, Hannah! Hannah, he's here! He's back! She barely heard me, though, through the music we had blasting, and Hannah was the team leader, who would help hide me from him, so she knew the huge fear I was going through. She walked towards the bathroom, shouting back, What are you saying? What's going on? Then she spotted him. I told her again, He's here, he's watching me, and she started shouting at him through the window. You need to leave, and if you don't, we're calling the police. I stepped out a little to see if he was leaving, but he was completely ignoring her, his eyes fixated in my direction. I stepped back into the bathroom, and Hannah continued to shout at him to leave and threatened him with the police. Then about 5 minutes passed, and he realized that I wasn't going to come out until he'd left, so finally he did. The next day, I and my leader told my manager that I wanted to file a police report, but he told me to wait until he talked with his boss. He showed up again that day, but I was only there to talk to my manager and leave right after, and when I got home, a friend convinced me to call the cops. So I texted my boss that I don't care what he or his boss says. I'm scared and I'm going to call the police. I dialed 911 and told them a summarized version of events, so they said they were going to send someone to my house to take the official report. The two officers were so nice and supportive, and I told them the whole story and how my boss didn't feel the need to get the cops involved, as I hadn't been harmed. The officers told me that I should have called right away and defended me, saying they could get him for harassment. I thanked them and they told me that if he showed up again to dial 911 so they could take him in for trespassing and harassment. I think that day my manager banned him and warned him though, because he didn't show up again after that. A few months later, when I was comfortable again with downtown, I went out with some friends to walk around. We were close to where I worked, and as we rounded a corner, I saw him. So I quickly ducked into a little corner store, and my friends followed. I told them I'd seen him, and they kept an eye out for me. Then once he was out of view, we left the store, and that was the last time I saw him. A few years ago, I, a 26-year-old female, used to work at a job that I usually wouldn't get off of until around 11 p.m. I didn't mind it for the most part, as I'm a night owl by nature, but I read a lot of LetsNotMeet posts and watch a lot of horror movies. I wouldn't say I'm paranoid, but I'm definitely cautious, shall we say. This one particular night, I was driving home along one of the main roads, and it was late enough that traffic was fairly scarce, but not so late that I felt like I was the only one out, especially because there had been a Jeep behind me for a good while at that point. When it came time for me to make my first turn, the Jeep followed, which wasn't particularly unusual, as I was still on a big road, so I didn't think anything of it. I needed to get gas, and luckily there was a fairly busy and well-lit station on my way home, and I feel like the layout is important, so bear with me. From the road I was on, you had to turn left onto a side street, then turn right onto a street that runs parallel with a grocery store. Then you turn right again to get into the gas station. It's a very specific destination, and there's no through traffic. And when I went to make the first left, the Jeep got into the turn lane with me. This is when I started paying attention. They had already been behind me for a good 10 to 15 minutes, and it seemed unlikely that they were just coincidentally going to the same gas station as me, considering how many there were in that area. But like I said, there's also a grocery store that's open 24 hours, so I thought maybe they were just going there. However, they still followed me after when I'd turned into the gas station. I pulled up to one of the pumps in the middle lane, put my car in park, and watched the Jeep in my rear view. There was no way in hell I was getting out of my car until I figured out what they were doing. And if they did pull up to a pump and start getting gas, I'd laugh at myself and carry on. They didn't pull up to a pump though. They lurked at the back of the lot, just idling in place for close to a minute. Finally, they started slowly driving around the far end of the pumps until they stopped again in front of my car, maybe 15 feet away. Unfortunately, they had tinted windows, so I couldn't see exactly who was in the car or what they were doing. But after another brief period of time, they just drove off. I got my gas and drove home, keeping an eye out, but I didn't see them again. I just realized something that honestly makes me sick to my stomach. If I hadn't decided to get gas that night, and if they were in fact following me, my next turn would have taken me into a very large, very dark, very empty park. It takes almost 5 minutes to drive through and has a million speed bumps, so there isn't any quick escape. I hate thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't stopped. I have no idea what they were doing and if they were for sure following me. Or was it just a coincidence after all? I'll never know for sure. But thanks, I hated it. One of my best friends from my childhood was getting married and asked me to be one of her bridesmaids. I was both honoured and excited, and about a year before the wedding, all the planning was getting sorted, like the dresses, etc. My friend, who I'll call Sarah for this story, called me to tell me that she was pairing me up with the groom's cousin. I was single and she let me know that she was setting me up with him, and that he was really cute and was a special guy. I was really excited at the idea of meeting him, and being a young naive 19-year-old, I entertained the idea that maybe we would get married, and I'd be asking Sarah to stand up at my wedding one day. Well, the months went by and the wedding day was here, and the night before they were having a wedding rehearsal at the church. I anxiously looked around for this supposed cute guy, and Sarah pointed him out and introduced us. My friend wasn't as excited as she was months ago when she told me about him, and it became obvious that the guy, I'll call him Gabe, was dating someone else. The girl, Maria, was on his arm and instantly gave me a cold stare. I figured that Gabe must have told Maria that he was being set up with me through Sarah, but Sarah didn't count on him finding somebody in the meantime. Sarah gave me a look that said sorry, but Gabe was very unattractive. Think Fat Bastard in an Austin Powers movie. And as I observed him, he was very obnoxious and immature with everyone there, so it wasn't a big loss to me. I was actually very relieved that he was dating Maria, as I didn't want to offend Sarah by saying I didn't like him. I didn't react with him at all, except for when I had to, and that was when I was instructed to walk up and down the aisle with him, as all the other bridesmaids had to do with their partners. Maria sat and watched me with a very malicious stare the whole time, and it was to the point where I became very uncomfortable. I immediately got the sense she was jealous of me, so I tried to show in my body language that I wasn't in the least bit interested in him, and I didn't speak to him unless I had to. At the wedding I was forced to dance with him. First it was the bride and groom, and then all of the wedding party had to dance as well. Maria kept following me everywhere with this nasty look, and she stood on the dance floor glaring at us. She was making it pretty obvious that she was jealous, and by this point my whole excitement for this wedding was no more. And when that dance was over, Gabe took Maria onto the dance floor and danced their own dance. It was obvious he was trying to appease her, and I actually felt sorry for him. She had this look of hatred towards me the whole night, even though I was nowhere near him. I ended up leaving the wedding early, because being followed around and treated like I was some kind of troublemaker was too much for me to handle. About a week after the wedding, I was working at my job as a bank teller. I was in charge of helping customers in the drive-through window, when I had a feeling I was being watched. I saw a girl who looked familiar, and she was in a car staring in my direction. I looked at the driver's license she sent in as she was cashing a check, and the name on it was Maria. I just about pissed myself. Now she knew where I worked, and from then on she would come to my work often, just to stare me down. I was prepared to tell my boss if it ever escalated, and I tried my best to ignore her, and she decided to leave me alone. About a year later, I was invited to another friend's work event, where my new friend Angie introduced me to her boss's daughter. And you guessed it, it was Maria. I was beyond shocked, I couldn't even say anything. She looked shocked too, but the evil stare was back, just like it was at the wedding. I became very intimidated and left soon after, and I never saw her again after that day. I heard she married Gabe and they had a couple of children together, but that wedding to this day is a bad memory for me. This wasn't a scary encounter, but it was one of my most frightening moments. When I was 5 and my brother was 9, My mum, after divorcing my father, got into a relationship with a man named Mike. At first she didn't tell us they were dating and just said he was a good friend of hers, so Mike would come visit us on the daily. Soon we found out they were dating though, when one night my brother caught them making out on the couch, and he came and woke me up to tell me. After my mum got caught by us, she started tearing up, saying she didn't want us to be mad at her because she'd found a man after weeks of divorcing my dad. Of course we tried to understand, but again we were kids, so we had barely any clue about what was happening. Way too many emotions at once for us to understand. After about a month, he started to move in with us, slowly but surely, and that's when we started noticing something was off about him. He was already in a relationship with another woman and had a daughter with her, but yet he was seeing my mum. My mum also knew he was with someone and had a child, so Mike's daughter would sometimes come over every 2 weeks to spend time with her dad and me, since we were friends. She was about a year or so younger than me. So Mike, over a couple of months, started to give up on everything and just depended on my mum to do everything for him. He quit his job, got drunk every night, and he was also allergic to cats, and we had a cat named Romeo at the time. Romeo wasn't a cat who loved attention. He was more just interested in sleeping and eating, like most cats. But every time Mike saw Romeo, he yelled at him even if Mike was the one to approach him. He would still yell at him, and when I mean yell, I mean full-on threaten to shoot the cat, just because it existed. Mike would also make me and my brother clean up his beer cans from all over the table and throw his cigarettes away. So obviously you can tell this dude was pretty much drunk 24/7, which was a major red flag, especially if you're living with kids. Sometimes I would hear yelling and screaming at night from him yelling at my mum, and I have an imprinted image in my mind of my mum cowering on the ground with fear and him standing up leaning over her screaming. He never hit her or anything, just screaming some fake BS that wasn't a big deal to be yelling about. Well, after a while we got tired of his behaviour, and my mum got back together with my dad and we moved out. We did it whilst Mike was out somewhere in a bar about 2 blocks down. We packed our stuff and left, so when he came home at some point, there was nothing left in the house, just silverware and toilet paper, because we were nice enough to leave him some. Well, after we'd moved out, my mum noticed his truck was always behind our car when we were going anywhere, and he even came onto our property at night to peep through my mum's bedroom window to see if my father was home, which most of the time at night he wasn't, because he was a nurse who worked night shifts. Sometimes I would even see his car parked in the middle of the road that we lived on, and he'd walk up to our house to peep through my window, as well as to see if I was up. I had night terrors as a kid, so I would be afraid to go to sleep most nights. We never saw him again after we got the police to follow behind us to see if he was there and arrest him for stalking. After he got out of jail, my mum filed a restraining order against his used-to-be girlfriend too, because she was a psycho bitch with problems. He had ruined some stuff for me that I see on a daily basis, like those storage units for people to put their extra stuff in if they don't have enough space in their house. He had one of those, and now every time I see them, it just gives me flashbacks of when me and him were in the car, going to his storage unit, and he got me his old Wii out for me to borrow. I do miss him, as he was nice to us at the beginning, but I guess people change. There was this time when my cousins, grandma, my siblings, my mum and I went to the zoo, and we were expecting to have a great day together with no worries. However, after a while of walking and looking around, my grandma wanted to rest, so she sat on a bench nearby, and beside her were a group of men in their late 20s. The rest of us just walked around the place, talking to each other, but I also noticed that that group of guys were looking at us in a very lustful way. My cousins, siblings and I were all under 14, and I was the eldest, which made me very uncomfortable, because I was the one responsible for everyone. My grandma and mum spent most of the day in deep conversation, so they didn't notice the fact that these men had started following us after we'd decided to continue our walk. Then about a minute or so later, we stopped to look at a certain animal. I don't remember which, as all I was focused on was the cat calling that we heard behind us. Then one of my cousins, who was the second eldest of us, whispered to me that the group of men were staring daggers at us. I was freaking out so much, but she just laughed it off. I was too scared to even tell my mum about it, because I thought she might scold me. For what I don't know, I was 14 at the time, so I just kept quiet. Later I decided to take the lead, walk right in front so that my grandma and mum, who were walking really slowly whilst immersed in their conversation, would be the ones between me and those creeps. I tried taking different turns as there were so many paths, and I just wanted them to get lost in the crowd. Many turns later, I met a dead end with only one door displaying the exit sign, so I had to turn back anyway. But when I did, the creeps were standing a few feet away from us, staring at us with smirks on their faces. No one else was on that path as it was leading to the exit, so it was just us and those men. As for my grandma and mum, they still hadn't noticed anything yet, so I boldly turned around and walked past the creeps without making eye contact, and I didn't stop until I'd gotten far away from there. My cousins and siblings had to jog to keep up, and my mum and grandma were really slow as always. But all I had in mind was to get rid of these guys as soon as possible. We ran deep into the crowd and even crossed a bridge to get to the other side of the river, just to try and lose them. But when I turned around to look, my heart sank as they were still following us, with sinister smiles on their faces. I remember wanting to cry so badly, but I held back my tears. Then I noticed them suddenly stop at the front of the bridge on the other side, and that's when they eventually stopped following us. It was then when a huge wave of relief hit me and we continued our stroll with ease. It's been 4 years since this happened, and still haunts me. My cousin and I still talk about it from time to time, but the rest of my cousins and siblings didn't even know it had occurred, even to this day. I've wanted to tell this story for a while now, but for some reason only just recently thought to post it here. For some background, I'm a female, and a couple of years ago, at the time this happened, I was 15, and I live in a small town where there isn't any violent crime that I know of. Now at this time in my life, I was going through a lot, and I had pretty crappy friends. It was the worst, but also the best year of my life though, because things didn't feel real to me, and I was detached in every sense of the word, which is probably why I didn't feel any fear towards this situation at the time. Now for the story itself. My best friend at the time was over at my house for a sleepover, and almost every time she'd come over, we'd sneak out and go to my town's local park and smoke pot, and this night was no different. We packed our bags, got dressed, and left the house at around 1 a.m. to 2 a.m., which was the normal time we'd go out. We walked the 10 minutes it took to get there and went to smoke at the skate park near the main park, which had a playground. But as we got there was an older man leaving, and as we were two young girls alone at night, we were kind of spooked out by it, imagining if he'd just killed us. We said it in a half-joking way, but looking back it was weird, as we went to this park almost every weekend, day and night, and we'd never seen this guy before. Not to mention I'd lived here my entire life and have never once seen him around. So we started smoking and were minding our own business, when we noticed two guys enter the park and go over to the swing set, which wasn't far away from us. They looked to be around our age, which we later found out to be true, and once they'd gotten to the swings, they also started smoking, which in a small town is really all there is to do, so we weren't surprised. We were happy to have some kind of company actually, and were thinking of going over to talk to them. But they suddenly got up and left, to which we thought, okay, they're leaving now, I guess we have the park to ourselves again. But then they came back, which we thought was weird. But hey, maybe they'd just forgotten something. But they kept doing this, leaving and coming back multiple times, and we were getting pretty weirded out by it. At some point by around 4 a.m, they left again, and my friend and I were getting bored. So we decided to go over to the swings, as the guys had left, so it's not their spot anymore. We packed up our stuff and walked the short distance to the swings, and after a couple of minutes of sitting there, one of us saw the guys come back and alerted the other. We noticed that they were walking over to the swing set, over to us. So we stood up and started packing up, ready to leave, because we thought they were going to get mad at us for being in their spot. But instead they just walked right up to us, and one of the guys struck up a conversation. But it wasn't a normal one. It went something like this. "Hi," they said. Then one of them said, we saw a guy hanging around here for a while, and he looked like he was kind of circling you guys, like he was watching you. And not to freak you two out or anything, but he was wearing a ski mask, and it looked like he was holding a knife. We think you guys should probably go home or something." Now I have never met these men before, and thought that maybe they were making it up just to scare us. But something about the concern in his voice made us think that they actually weren't messing with us. So we said we would leave pretty soon, and the guys left again. I didn't have much regard for my safety at that time, and my friend was too high to care. So we both decided that although we would leave, we wanted to take a small walk first. So as the guys left, we made our way onto the sidewalk that looped around the tennis court. We got about halfway to the end of it then, when the guys started walking over again, this time with more meaning. I remember they seemed kind of paranoid, looking around somewhat frantically at their surroundings, and they walked right up to us, and in a more rushed tone than before, and one of them spoke up again and said, "Listen, we saw the guy in those bushes, so we're going to walk you both home, all right?" He motioned to the bushes along the road right in front of us. By this point, my friend had a better grasp on the situation and agreed, so we left together. But as we approached the bushes, the guys walked my friend and I to the other side of the road, away from them. Then we entered a large field that is across from the park, and the guys walked in front of us. One of them was walking backwards, so he was facing us, while the other was definitely more zooted than his friend, so he was facing ahead, probably just trying to keep himself walking steadily. We were chatting with one of the guys, when at some point, either he or my friend looked behind us and called attention to the bushes. We all turned then and looked, and lo and behold, I watched a person's head pop up from inside them. The streetlights weren't amazing, but from what I could see, his face wasn't clear to me. I then quickly remembered that the guys had said the man was wearing a ski mask, and it all kind of dawned on me then how serious this situation really was. I didn't feel as much fear as I probably should have, but I was starting to sober up a tiny bit, and thankfully the four of us got home safely that night. I've sat with this story for a while, and I've realized how many elements make more sense than I realized at the time. And even though I might have been high, I know what I saw, and all four of us can attest that something detrimental could have happened that night. I don't remember their names, but I will never forget those guys and how they probably saved our lives. I've gone back to the park at night many times since then, but I'm paranoid every time, and sometimes I think I can see him in the shadows. To think that if the guys hadn't come back for us a second time, we would have walked next to the bushes like we normally did, not knowing there was someone in there waiting for us. Sometimes I wonder if that wasn't the only time he was at the park. Just because we'd never seen him before doesn't mean he'd never seen us. This happened to me approximately a year ago or so. I, a 23-year-old female, was driving to meet up with a friend at around 9 p.m. I had to drive through a shady town in order to reach his house, and in all honesty, he himself didn't live in the best area. As I drove through this part, I went into a turn lane, But when I did this, I heard a loud honk from someone and didn't understand why. So I just shrugged it off and went about my route. As I turned onto the highway though, I happened to glance in my rearview mirror and took note of the car behind me, feeling a little uneasy about it. I just felt suspicious for some reason. I shook it off though, assuring myself I was just being paranoid, as I'm that type of person, and I carried on my drive for about 5 to 10 minutes before I hit my exit. During that time I had to switch lanes to pass other cars as you do, and the car that I'd noticed earlier followed me to a T with each lane switch. So now majorly freaked out, I was praying that they weren't going to follow me off my exit. But no such luck. As soon as I put on my turn signal, they did the same, and a shiver ran through me as I had no idea what to do. I called my friend and told him what was going on, so he agreed to be outside waiting for me when I arrived, just in case this car was actually following me. From the exit I was still 10 minutes out. But again, during those 10 minutes, this car behind me stayed close, followed every turn I made, and at that point I knew for a fact they were following me. Well, as my luck has it, I called my friend up to tell them I was close, and that I was actually turning onto his street right then, according to the GPS. But he said he couldn't see any cars, and asked where I was, even though the GPS was saying I had arrived. I was in some back alleyway, with an abandoned bus and a few other cars that looked to be gutted. Now I admit that pulling over was probably the dumbest thing I've ever done, and I should have just kept driving. But by this point I was in denial that this person might actually try to interact with me. Like honestly, it just seemed too crazy to be true. So I pulled over, described my surroundings to my friend, and thankfully he knew exactly where I was. I was actually a few blocks away from him, so he said he'd walk over to me. During this time I looked out of my window and saw the car that had been following me had stopped right next to me. My eyes became wide with fear, and I was now officially freaked out. The person was a man, but I couldn't really make out any features as it was dark, and he had his hood pulled up. He sat next to me trying to get me to roll down my window, so I made sure my car was locked and grabbed my pepper spray from the seat next to me. I didn't know what he was going to do, what I was going to do, and I was officially freaking out on the phone to my friend. He started running at that point to come to me, because I was basically crying by this point. But to hell with it, I thought, and threw my car into reverse, backing away from him so he wasn't next to me anymore. He ended up hanging out his window and shouting at me, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. My friend said he was close, and as he turned the corner it seemed the dude had given up and driven off. Then my friend reached my car and got in, asking me if I was okay because I was visibly shaking. So I work the swing shift at a mill, which is 5 p.m. to 1:30 a.m, and it's a 30-minute drive to and from my house, so I get home fairly late. One night as I was driving home, I decided I was going to call my cousin, just to wake him up. We do this to each other. He's on rotating shifts, so he will call me at all hours too. And for the record, he started it. So I pulled into this park and ride kind of thing at the county line, and reached into the back seat to grab my cell phone, as I keep it in my bag sometimes. As I got situated and ready to call him, I noticed this sedan with its brights on pull in and proceed to park right behind me. Now this was an empty parking lot at this time of night, and there was no reason they needed to be right behind me. I'm not one who gets easily rattled, but I had a really bad feeling about this person. So I put my pickup in drive, drove over the parking curbs and headed towards home. About 20 seconds after I turned onto the highway, I saw the same car following me. At this point I wasn't sure if they were following me or not, but either way I certainly didn't want to lead them to where my house is, so I took a side road. Looking in my rearview mirror, and sure enough they'd made the same turn. But whatever, I thought, must be a coincidence. I then took a right onto a dirt road and turned around, and as I did this, I saw the sedan at the start of the dirt road, just sitting there. This is where I die, I thought. I do carry a firearm, but I never ever want to have to use it. It's obviously strictly just for protecting myself and my loved ones, and I would want to avoid situations where I'd ever have to use it. It was just there if I needed it is all. I decided then that I was going to go into four-wheel drive and go towards this guy, then at the last second dip into the ditch and back onto the main road behind him. So I did just that and decided to go back where it started, the park and ride. Now the reason why I did this is because I didn't want to lead this person to my home. So I drove back really fast, making sure the driver didn't see the turns I'd made beyond that. I parked off the side of the road across from that lot and waited a few minutes. There's a sharp corner past the lot that I drive around every day to get home, so I was hoping if they were following me, they'd be driving fast to try and catch me. And sure enough, I saw the little sedan driving very, very fast around the corner and onto the straight stretch. All my lights were off and my truck is dark grey, so thankfully I wasn't spotted. Then I waited until he drove further down the road. Then I turned my lights back on and turned back to head home. Just then though, in my rearview mirror, way down the straight stretch, I saw brake lights and him turning his car around. I decided to start driving slowly after I'd see where I turned to get to the dirt road, and I turned off my lights again. I saw headlights, then realized, yep, little sedan, and they turned back onto the road that leads to the dirt road. I don't know what it was or why I'm still frightened. I guess they may have been trying to reach me about my truck's extended warranty, but I highly doubt it. Just before Christmas, I went out to a works-do at a restaurant with all my colleagues. Then I left the restaurant at around 11 p.m. after a good evening and grabbed a cab. I had the cab drop me at a cash machine because I didn't have any, but it was fine as the machine is only a 10-minute walk to my house, and the restaurant is more than a 15-minute drive. I paid the cabbie and started walking, and took the quickest route, which is through a bus depot, as obviously there's nobody about that late. As I walked through, though, I saw someone standing there, about 40 to 50 feet away. I thought nothing of it, as maybe they were someone who worked there. I could see it was a man, and he had on a grey hoodie and some blue work combat trousers. I carried on my way, and as I turned into the next street, I began to get this weird feeling. I shrugged it off and just kept walking, and as I rounded the next corner, I happened to look left down the street I'd just come from, and there was the guy, still about 40 feet away, walking in my direction. Coincidence? I carried on walking, and it became clear after 2 more turns that he was definitely following me. Either that or it was a pretty big coincidence. No, I'm not usually easily rattled, but I was beginning to plan ahead on this walk. What can I do? Where can I go that's safe? I'm still not positive he's actually following me. So I tested my theory by stopping and taking off my heels. As A, it's easy for him to knock me over and chase me in them, and I stand a better chance of running and fighting barefoot. And B, if he loiters as I do, he's definitely following me. I felt like my fears were quashed then though, as he didn't loiter. He walked past me and on as I pretended to struggle with my heel. I was now only 2 minutes from home, and he rounded a corner and vanished. Phew. My 2-minute walk home was uneventful. I got in, shut the door, drank some water and went upstairs to my bedroom that faces the street, and I nearly fell over in shock. The bloke was standing across the street, studying my house, intently staring at my front door and ground floor window. I freaked out and called my friend, but before her and her boyfriend had arrived, he'd vanished again. This still creeps me out now. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.